A continuing question in Aelred's spiritual works is how to know God, how to find God. And in some of the works, on Jesus as a boy of 12, and on the Mirror of Charity, and on the Formation of Anchoresses, he starts by actually calling attention to the presence of God in the memory, so that the treatise itself and the audience of the treatise starts out by being reminded of God. In the case of Mirror of Charity, that person is reminded of God's lovability and of creating humankind in his image, and that the soul is the image of God. In Jesus as a boy of 12, we start out by looking for Jesus, but knowing that we already did know the story before. And on the Formation of Anchoresses, we are told that the anchoress should have an image of the Passion of Jesus on the cross on her altar. What I'm talking about now is his work, his very famous work. I think, in fact, now the work that most people know most about, which is on spiritual friendship. This book has gotten a lot of reputation because people are interested in friendship, and as a result, one of the effects has been that some people really argue that friendship is the key to Aelred's thought. I don't actually think that, but there's something about the natural appeal of what he does in this work that has caused some people to see it as central to everything he does. But, interestingly, in this work, he doesn't start with putting Christ present. He does in a way, but instead of starting with God and then working forward, we start actually with human experience. So he writes this work as a dialogue. He uses a dialogue in order to teach, in order to involve other people, his students, in the ideas that he's presenting. But in fact, in this work, he starts not with the dialogue proper, but with a prologue. And in the prologue, he remembers that when he was a boy, presumably while he was a student, while he was growing up in Scotland, he read Cicero's book, De Amicitia, on friendship. And he was really fascinated by it, and he loved it. And by the way, this tells us something about the fact that he was reading. He was being educated while he was at court in Scotland. But he really loved Cicero's work, and he liked it so much that he thought if he could just find a friendship like that, that would be good. But even more, he would like to see if he could write a book like that. So here we have Aelred defining himself, as he does in other places, as someone who wants to write, who when he reads a good book, thinks to himself, I could write a book like that. But he says that after he came to the monastery, he read a lot of works of the fathers, and he became acquainted with the sweet name of Christ. And he decided that Cicero's work now seemed insipid to him because it lacked the sweet name of Christ. So he decides that he will write a work about friendship, but a friendship that can be supported with Scripture. So his prologue actually defines himself as a writer, as someone who is influenced by an author, wanting to write a work like Cicero's, and that would seem to be one reason that he starts writing with dialogues, and with wanting to see if he can do better than his model. The prologue probably was written after the work as a whole was. We don't know that for sure, but I'll show you a reason in a minute for thinking that. But so we start with the prologue, and then we go into the dialogue. Now, in the dialogue itself, we have 3 books. The first book starts, as I was suggesting, not with God, not with a reminder of Christ in his human life or in his passion. It starts, in fact, with a young monk coming to Aelred, and Aelred says to him, I was watching you. You were part of that crowd of monks talking. There was a lot of chatter going on and a lot of chaos, and I noticed you kind of making gestures and wanting to talk to me and wanting to interrupt, and here you are now. So what is it that you want? And the young monk, whose name is Ivo, and some of you will recognize the name Ivo because it has showed up in Aelred's work on Jesus as a Boy of 12. This monk named Ivo says, I was really wanting to talk to you, and I'm grateful to you for noticing that I was wanting to talk to you. I think this is an interesting point. It's very easy as a lecturer, as a teacher, to get so caught up in oneself that one doesn't notice people's hands or doesn't notice the person over there in the corner whose hand has been up all day while somebody more lively keeps interrupting. And so one of the things that Aelred does as he begins with this is to put in the voice of the monk the recognition that Aelred is attentive, not only in a one-on-one relationship, but when there's a whole crowd of people talking, Aelred is noticing who's wanting to talk to him. So here's how we begin this. The first book ends, and I'm just going to give you an overview of the dialogue. The first book of the 3 ends when Aelred says, well, I'm afraid we have to go now. I have other things to do. And Ivo says, well, I'm disappointed by that, but in fact I have to go to supper, which I'm obligated to attend. So that's the end of the first book. The second book begins with a different monk present. And the monk who's present this time is Walter. Now, in the life of Aelred, Walter Daniel, who wrote this work, says quite boastfully, Walter is a boastful type, he says that he worked for Aelred and that he loved Aelred and that Aelred included him in one of his works. And so, sure enough, here we have a Walter. I will say it's not a terribly flattering picture of Walter. He's too full of himself. He's too talkative. He's too ready to sort of make jabs at his friend Gratian, who shows up in a few minutes. But indeed, Walter is a main character. And he begins by saying, it seems to me that I heard you say many years ago that you and your friend Ivo had a long conversation about friendship. Isn't that right? And Aelred said, well, yes, it is. And he says, I'd really like to hear about that conversation. And Aelred says, well, as it happens, I just ran on to those notes. This is the trope of the busy professor with a cluttered desk. Every student likes to laugh about his professor's cluttered desk. And in this case, Walter is happy to make a joke about Aelred's desk being too full. But Aelred says the reason it has taken him so long to get back to this is that in the time being, Ivo has died. But now he's found the notes, and he says that Walter can look at them, but he would like Walter not to share them with anybody else because he might like to do some editing before he passes them around. Here we again have Aelred identifying himself as author and as self-conscious interest, having a self-conscious interest in the quality of his writing. So he says to Walter, sure, you can read my notes, and we'll talk about it later. At the end of this book, Aelred says, well, I'm sorry I have to leave now, but I do because we have some distinguished visitors coming, and it's just time. And so Walter and Gratian, the second monk, leave. But Walter says, well, he'll come, he'll leave, but he certainly hopes that Gratian won't be late next time. So we're carrying on the kind of joking quality of the relationship between these two. Book 3 begins, and Gratian is there first, and then Walter comes. And this third book ends with a vision of paradise. Now, I start by telling you the structure of this because it seems to me terribly important in terms of Aelred's wanting to dramatize the question of friendship. He has decided to write a book, a dialogue, dramatizing a relationship among various monks. First, the abbot and young Ivo, then the abbot and Walter and Gratian. And each of these first books ends with a separation because that's what's true in human life. You never can go on too long. You always have something else to do. And when you have something else to do, that may leave some of the parties disappointed or, like Ivo, in fact, looking forward to supper. But as he finishes the 3 books, he ends not again with the brokenness of human experience, but of the rising through friendship to the love of God. So I wanted to spell that out first so that you know that this is a work that has a shape, that it's a dramatic vision of friendship. Sometimes people talk about this work as though Aelred had a tape recorder underneath his bench, and that everything that happens in the dialogue really happened. But in fact, this is a carefully shaped dialogue in which Aelred teaches us about the nature of friendship, the origin of friendship, the fruit of friendship, and the relationship between friendship and the love of God. So whereas those other works I talked about begin by reminding us of the sacred humanity of Jesus or God placing his image in us, this one is set very much within the world of the monastery. And it's a world that starts out in a kind of, I would like to say, loving chaos, where there's a lot going on. And it seems to me worth wondering how much this is a picture of 12th century monasteries. If, in fact, you have scenes in which there are a lot of monks kind of joking around, what does that tell us about what life was like in Rivaux in the 12th century? So once Aelred and Ivo begin to talk, Aelred says to Ivo, "You and I are here, and the third with us, I trust, is Christ." So we do begin, in fact, with a reminder of Christ at the beginning. A friend of mine says that he thinks that this is a reminder of the dinner at Emmaus, or the road to Emmaus, where the 2 disciples are walking along together, and then Jesus joins them. So he thinks that this line, in this case, reminds us of the people walking along and Christ becoming part of the conversation. So Ivo says, "Well, I did want to talk to you, and what I really wanted to talk to you about was the nature of friendship. I myself," Ivo says, "have had a real interest in friendship." And Aelred says, "You know what you should do? You should read Cicero." Because this is what a good teacher does, is to say, I know a book on the subject, and perhaps you can find what you want there. And Ivo says, "Well, I have read Cicero, but Cicero doesn't actually include the name of Christ, and so he's not enough for me." This is an interesting echo, right? This is why I think that Aelred wrote his prologue later, because he already has Ivo in the work who's articulating this idea, but he says then, well, this is the history of this book. But Ivo articulates his dissatisfaction with Cicero. Cicero just isn't enough. And I will say, by the way, that Cicero's dialogue on friendship is certainly good and revered and everything, but it's not very believable as a dialogue, because mostly the young men in the dialogue just keep saying, "Oh, yes, tell us more. Oh, yes, that's excellent." Whereas Aelred's dialogue, in this dialogue as in the others he writes, is open to the other person in the dialogue as saying, "I don't understand. I don't agree with you. That's too hard. Are you saying this?" And so he turns it into a real kind of dialogue of people talking about a subject. So he begins to talk with Ivo about the nature of friendship. And Ivo wants to think about what friendship means and what's the definition of it. And Aelred says, well, do you want a better definition than the one you found in Cicero? He says in Cicero, he defines friendship as agreement in all things human and divine with goodwill and charity. And in fact, this definition recurs throughout the work, throughout all three books. But you notice, it doesn't say anything about Christ. The sweet name of Christ is not present in this definition. So Aelred has, on the one hand, been very clear in the prologue and in Ivo's words, and in his recommendation of Cicero to Ivo, and then in using this quotation. This is his core definition. And yet it doesn't do what both he as teacher and Ivo as student have asked for. So we have a contradiction here at the beginning, and I can't really resolve that contradiction except that as Aelred goes ahead and talks about it, he says, well, wouldn't you believe that, that Christians care about agreement in all things human and divine? And later he adds something about, and for good people especially. Ivo has some objections to some of the discussion of friendship, and he says that that Cicero has said, for example, that there just are so few true friends. I mean, really, you can only find one or two true friends in a lifetime. And Aelred says, well, that may have been true for Cicero, but in fact, we have thousands of friends. And he talks a little bit about the early church. He talks about specific instances of friends, but he says, if you look at the early church, you find that where it started with just a few people, it developed into thousands of friends who, in fact, shared agreement in all things, both human and divine. And this is the first of maybe 5 times in this work that he cites this passage from Acts about their having all things in common. So he is already moving this discussion in the direction of the church, even though he hasn't really spelled that out yet. He also does something in this way where he's talking about, in this work, he's talking about friendship. He's leading us in the direction of community as well, to suggest that friendship may start with you and I are here, and Christ among us, but that as in the early church, they started out with a few pairs of friends. They started out with the disciples, and by now, in the 12th century, there are thousands of pairs of friends. So the idea that friendship grows into larger numbers and that it's not limited to just 2 people and 2 people. It's not just Damon and Pythias, but it is, in fact, all the members of the church who are friends with one another. He goes on then, and Ivo has a number of questions about this. And one of the questions is whether there's a distinction between love and charity. Because Aelred says that the idea of friendship comes from the word, that is, that the word friend, amicus, comes from the word amor. And so Ivo is interested in this idea and says, well, is there a difference between love and charity? And is there a difference between charity and friendship? And Aelred says there's a great distinction. Divine authority commands that many more be received into the clasp of charity than to the embrace of friendship. The law of charity says that we must welcome not only our friends, but also our enemies. but we call friends only those to whom we have no qualm about entrusting our heart and all its contents. So here we have a basic statement about a difference between charity and friendship. And he says, in another place, he says, we have to love everybody. Everybody is bound to us in charity, even though sometimes that's irritating, which I find one of his wonderfully honest remarks that, yeah, we know we have to love people even if we don't like them at all, and even if they complicate our lives a lot, but friendship is something that we're not bound to. Nobody, there is no law of friendship. Nobody can tell you who to be friends with. This is something that happens. And then he moves into explaining to us where it comes from. He says that he thinks friendship really emerges from nature, that it's part of the nature of things. And he says that God, who is the great, the founder of nature, the creator of nature, that God wants to make sure in his own love of society that all his creatures share the love of society. So he says, if you look around, you notice that you never see, for example, one rock standing alone. There are always lots of rocks. I was looking today at the floor of your church and looking at all those pebbles and wondering how they built it and how many pebbles they scooped up. How many thousands of pebbles did it take to make the floor of your church? You never see a stone alone. And I think about early Revo, when they're clearing land and they're building, and how many stones they must have had to deal with. And he says, and it's also true of animals. It's also true, you never see a squirrel alone. All animals, you don't see one deer, you see a bunch of deer. Because God has made it that way, that all his creatures are bound together by the love of society. And what's more, angels. You never see an angel alone, do you? Well, you may have an angel show up alone, but in fact, the angels live together in a host, and they come together to celebrate the birth of Jesus in a host of angels. Well, if this is true for rocks and for squirrels and for angels, how much more true is it of humans? So he says, he determined that peace should guide all his creatures and society unite them. Thus, from him who is supremely and uniquely one, all should be allotted some trace of his unity. And therefore, it was from no similar, nor even from the same material, that divine might formed the helpmate of the first man. But as a clearer inspiration to charity and friendship, he produced the woman from the very substance of the man. How beautiful it is that the second human being was taken from the side of the first, so that nature might teach that human beings are equal and, as it were, collateral, and that there is in human affairs neither a superior nor an inferior. Now, there are a couple things about this. One is that it's a remarkable idea that the birth of Eve from the side of Adam means that they are equal. And it's a remarkable idea that in human affairs there is no superior or inferior. There are different roles, but it's not as though some are naturally superior. Also, I think, and this is just a side note, I think this line that human beings are equal and, as it were, collateral is a wonderfully funny line. That the woman taken from the side of the man is collateral with him. I think Aelred surpasses himself with that line. So he goes on and talks about this relationship, and he says the thing is, at first then, all humans were friends. It's simple, right? All humans were friends. Because after all, there's only Adam and Eve, and they were friends, and so that's it. But But in time, there were more and more people, and so, for a time, friendship and charity were the same thing. But then the fall happened, and when Adam and Eve and presumably their children, whether born yet or not, were cast out of paradise, well, things get complicated. And pretty soon you were still supposed to love everybody, but you didn't really like everybody so much. And so people began to make a distinction between charity and friendship. So we still have friendship, but only among some people. We have charity. We have responsibility for charity all the time. There's a law of charity. Friendship, and this is my phrasing, not Aelred's, but friendship, it seems to me he defines as what is left over from paradise. That the great joy of friendship is that it's not commanded, that it's not something that had to be sort of created to allow us relationship and peace among one another, but that friendship is that which Adam and Eve had, a relationship in which there is not a superior or an inferior, in which all humans are collateral, and to show that we are all equal to one another. That's left over from paradise. It's also worth saying that Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century echoes this line a little differently. He says that woman is not above man, that she should be superior, was not made from man's head that she should be superior, and not from his feet that she should be inferior, but from his side that she should be equal. I don't know whether Chaucer got that idea from here, but it's obviously a rephrasing of the same kind of idea, and I think this is the first time that someone has made this kind of comment. So, then he goes on, and this passage comes at the very end, near the very end of the first book, before they break up. Well, Evo is startled by a lot of this, and is still concerned about how to understand the relationship between friendship and charity. And so he says, would it be fair then to say what John said about charity? Would it be fair to say that God is charity? And Aelred says, well, I wouldn't go that far because it doesn't have the authority of Scripture. But I would say that the rest of that verse is true, that the one who abides in friendship abides in God. Now, I'd like to make the point here that Aelred does not say God is friendship. He does not say that. You will read 15 books that say Aelred says God is friendship, and he doesn't. What happens is Evo, the young monk who's trying to understand, says, so, would you say God is friendship? And Aelred says, no. It's very important to distinguish between an author and the character, and so I'd just like to be clear that Aelred did not say God is friendship, but he did say that that the one who abides in friendship abides in God. So then he goes on, and in Book 2, well, Evo is no longer with us. Evo has died. Aelred is very influenced in writing this work by Cicero, as I've already said, but also by Augustine. And in both of those cases, the work on friendship is prompted by the death of a friend. This work, Aelred certainly knows that fact, and he then has Evo die before the second book. Why? I think it is to suggest precisely the way death disrupts friendship. That friendship does not go forward uninterrupted. It does not go forward in human affairs smoothly, but that even the best of friendships can be interrupted by the death of one of the friends. He doesn't say that, but I've spent time trying to understand why he moves the death of Evo to that point. I will tell you that many scholars, maybe most scholars, think that Evo really died and Aelred put his notes down and didn't get back to them for a while, and when he finally did, well, it had been a long time, and so they date the first book of this several years before the second and third books. I think that's sort of nonsense. I mean, it may be true, but I think it's more interesting to ask, why does Aelred put the death of Evo here? And is there that kind of intentional break? What is the intention of that rhetorical break? So I leave that with you as a puzzle. Did Evo really die? Is that the reason Aelred lost his pages for a while? Or was Aelred trying to do something else with this kind of interruption? So when he starts again, Walter is there, and he wants to hear more about friendship. And so Aelred talks a lot about friendship and its nature. And he says, and now we're moving on toward the love of God, one truth surpasses all others. Close to perfection is that level of friendship that consists in the love and knowledge of God, when one who is the friend of another becomes the friend of God. According to that verse of our Savior in the Gospel, I shall no longer call you servants, but friends. So now we have, in Book 2, having already heard that friendship was part of the order of creation, that God creates friendship along with creating all of nature and all the creatures, in Book 2, we have moved on to the idea of not just Christ is present with us, we were created by God to be friends, but now that Jesus himself has said, I will call you no longer servants, but friends. And so we have moved in this second book into a second level of understanding the nature of friendship. Walter, who is a difficult sort, he was apparently a difficult sort if it really is Walter Daniel. He was a difficult sort in life, and he's a difficult sort in Book 2. He argues, he jabs, he makes fun of Gratian. Even at the end of the book, he's arguing with Gratian. And Aelred, as he talks about the nature of friendship, he says, in friendship are joined honor and charm, truth and joy, sweetness and goodwill. Not too steep or unnatural does the accent appear from Christ as the inspiration by the love with which we love our friend, to Christ giving himself to us as our friend for us to love. And thus, friend cleaving to friend in the Spirit of Christ is made with Christ but one heart and one soul, and so mounting aloft through degrees of love to friendship with Christ, an echoing of that. He is made one spirit with him in one kiss. Aspiring to this kiss, the saintly soul cries out, let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. Clearly, we've moved far forward with our understanding of friendship. Walter, who, as I say, is difficult, thinks that everything Aelred is saying about friendship is just too demanding. He himself likes, he says, the kind of relationship he has with Gratian, with a lot of joking. To be able to come together in the evening and chat about things and to make jokes and argue, but he's not that interested in the kind of friendship that advances through Christ, that joins with Christ. He doesn't want to do that. And Aelred says, well, suppose you had all the good things in the world, but you didn't have friends. Suppose you had anything you wanted to eat and the best houses and the best relationships with your animals. You had everything you wanted, but you had no friends. Would that do for you? And Walter says, oh, come to think of it, I guess not. Maybe that's not so good. And then they separate for the second time at the end of the separate book. So we have they've had a chance to think about the nature of friendship, and then they go away. And then we come to the third book. And in the third book, we are, as is true with others of Aelred's works, we are rising ever higher. There's a personal anecdote in here. where Aelred says, "The day before yesterday, as I was walking the round of the cloister of the monastery, the brethren were sitting around, forming, as it were, a most loving crown. In the midst, as it were, of the delights of paradise, with the leaves, flowers, and fruits of each single tree, I marveled. In that multitude of brethren I found no one whom I did not love, and no one by whom I am felt sure I was not loved. I was filled with such joy that it surpassed all the delights of this world." The joys of human friendship, the joys of all loving all, is now giving us a taste now in this world of the delights of paradise. We're not there yet, but we're experiencing the way friendships can be a most loving crown. A little later, he goes on to say, "We shall rejoice in the supreme and eternal good when the friendship to which on earth we welcome but few will pour out over all and flow back to God from all. For God will be all in all." And so we approach the end, and as we have moved through friendship and have recognized the joys of friendship, and have recognized that God created us as friends, and that God himself, that Jesus himself, had said that we were his friends. As we move to the end of this, Aelred is giving us a picture, a rising toward a picture of true paradise. And he says, "Thus rising from that holy love with which a friend embraces a friend to that with which a friend embraces Christ, one may take the spiritual fruit of friendship fully and joyfully into the mouth, while looking forward to all abundance in the life to come. When the fear is dispelled that now fills us with dread and anxiety for one another, when the hardship is removed that we must now endure for one another, when, moreover, along with death, the sting of death is removed, the sting that so often pierces and distresses us and makes us grieve for one another, then, with the beginning of relief from care, we shall rejoice in the supreme and eternal God. When the friendship to which on earth we admit but few will pour out over all and flow back to God from all, for God will be all in all." Here again we have the summit, the vision of paradise. And notice something interesting. What happened? How did we lose friendship in the first place? How does it happen that we can't all be friends with one another? Well, it's Adam, of course. I mean, it's always Adam's fault. Adam and Eve, tasting of the fruit in the garden, managed to throw us all out of the garden. And we've spent generations, centuries, separated from the love of God in which we were created. And what happens? As we love one another, as we are friends with one another, as we pray for one another, we slide gently, almost unnoticeably, into the embrace of Christ. And what do? We take the spiritual fruit of friendship fully and joyfully into the mouth. We return, in fact, to Eden. We return now to the fruit that is not the fruit of discord, the fruit of greed, the fruit of wanting to be more than God made us. But we take the fruit of friendship and the fruit of friendship with Christ into the mouth, and then at last, God will be all in all.